the government is not taking more of the economy or spending more as a share of the economy than they were before.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to ask, you've commented on economic growth and drawn a line to structural changes that can be put into place by way of programs that will add to economic growth. And here you've called for, or you voiced support for the government's vision on a national early learning and childcare program. Other countries have pursued this. Quebec has pursued it with great benefit for its economic growth in general terms. Can you speak more about how, in your view, a program like this would add to economic growth for Canada?
So it would add to economic growth in the same way that it added to Quebec's economic growth during a similar program, which is now about over 20 years old. So what it does is it allows for an uptick in in particular female labor force participation. Labor force growth is the most important ingredient of economic growth. Put in as simple as possible terms, the growth in the economy will be equal to labor force growth plus whatever productivity growth we're able to generate. We may be able to get, let's say, with the Canadian labor force is no longer generating growth. All of our growth pretty well is now coming from immigration. So if we have immigration of around 1% per year, we can generate 1% economic growth every year. On top of which we get maybe half a point or even as much as 1 percentage point from productivity improvements. So what we can do is add to that equation some decimal points by getting more women to participate in the workforce through a more fulsome childcare early learning program. It worked in Quebec, and it's one of the reasons why Quebec's finances are in better condition going into the COVID than other provinces. So, I just said, as I said in my remarks, I see no reason why it couldn't add as much as 2% onto the level of national income. That's $40 to $50 billion per year of additional national income. And it's also, of course, additional tax revenues that come with that.
The point that's been raised by some, and we heard it in one of our sessions.
Sorry, Peter, we're over.
Oh,
I was on mute when I tried to cut you off.
I promise I didn't try and pull a trick there, Mr. Chair. I promise.
Well, I think Gabriel and Peter Julian are competing in colorful rooms here today. Go ahead, Gabriel. You're on for 6 minutes, and followed by Mr. Julian.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, debt that we might incur to that end.
Okay, we will have to end that round there, and we'll go to, I believe, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Falk and Ms. Jensen splitting time? No? Who's on?
Mr. Easter, I'll be taking this round. Thanks.
Okay, you guys are switching all over the place today.
We are.
Mr. Fast for 5 minutes, followed by Ms. Zerowitz.
Yeah, that's what we call elasticity, Mr. Chair.
Okay, good.
Mr. Poloz, Stephen, nice to have you back at committee and nice to see you again. I wanted to address your opening comments. You referred to the inflationary impacts of stimulus and you tended to downplay them. I think the term you used was that they're transitory. Now, if they're not transitory and they're more pervasive and persistent, would you agree with me that that would represent a significant challenge to the sustainability premise of the budget?
Well, it's a highly hypothetical question, isn't it? I mean, to me, the sorts of policies that have been put in place around the world post-COVID all look to people as if they would be inflationary. But what they're doing is counteracting an enormous deflationary force to keep us roughly where we should be. When things normalize, one would need to transition to a more normalized set of policies across the wide front. And that, of course, is a matter of judgment when that actually takes place. And given that central banks, for virtually everyone that I know about, is pursuing inflation targets, then you'd expect them to continue to pursue those inflation targets. So to me, it's almost too hypothetical. If you're asking the question, what happens to government debt when inflation goes up? Well, indebtedness goes down because the economy, as it's measured in terms of national income, today, let's say it goes up. If things settle to normal and we're growing at, say, 2% per year, real, and 2% inflation, that would be 4% nominal growth.
That was not my question. My question was actually the premise on which the budget was built was that, in fact, the stimulus measures that were being introduced, the stimulus that's sitting on the sidelines and savings accounts on the corporate and household side, the stimulus, massive stimulus on the American side, that it's all transitory, will not have significant, pervasive, sustained impacts on inflation. Therefore, don't worry about interest rates. They're going to stay around where they are right now. If those assumptions are wrong, if you're wrong about the inflationary impacts of the stimulus, that changes a lot, doesn't it? I mean, that's my question.
Well, if that premise is wrong, then the economy will show signs of being much stronger sooner than expected, and those very same elastic policies that we talked about will immediately retreat and reduce the amount of stimulus that is being delivered. That's the beauty of the automatic formulation that's being used. So if you're talking super hypothetical, is it possible to overstimulate? It is, but I argued in my remarks that going gradual as occurred during the 2008 to 2010 period left long legacy of permanent scars on the economy. And I think that suggests that a more rapid return to normalcy here will reduce the amount of scarring and therefore reduce the permanent effects.
I hope you're right. I really
hope so too.
Right. Listen, I want to touch on one other thing. And that is, you mentioned that the increase in housing prices isn't necessarily inflation. That housing price inflation would have to be sustained for it to be considered inflation. Listen, out my way, out on the West Coast, we've had sustained housing inflation for a long time. And if your statement were out there, just hanging out there, I know it's going to attract a lot of attention. So do you want to clarify that?
So what I want to clarify is that StatsCan captures the cost of living in a home in your consumer price index. Of course it does. And importantly, that includes not just the price of a house, but also the cost of servicing the mortgage that goes with it. And if you look at charts that show debt service in the household sector, you see that basically the household sector has maintained a pretty constant level of debt service because the rise in house prices has been offset by falling interest rates, roughly speaking. Not everywhere, but for the aggregate economy. And so for that reason, we don't see a lot of evidence of rising skyrocketing house prices showing up as part of consumer prices. I know that individual markets, prices have gone up tremendously. And as I've said previously, that is a side effect that is pretty hard to avoid when you're stimulating the economy like this, and it's the main area that's growing. And so that the best antidote to that is to increase the supply of houses. That's to me the most important thing. Houses are in short supply.
Of course, that's easier said than done.
We are
Agreed.
Quite a bit over, so we'll have to move on to. Thank you very much, Mr. St. Marie.
Oui, merci. Je commencerai.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to start with a comment. I'd just like to remind the guests that from my point of view, all of the MPs do agree that we should increase interprovincial trade. It's not because we didn't support it, and we're not against it, not at all. There's been a study done from my point of view. This is something that's very important, and these are negotiations that need to happen between provinces. Canada is a federation, and we see that there's more and more strength. We're seeing everything being decided in Ottawa. Well, I think that we do have different levels of government, and not everything needs to come from Ottawa. And on that, there's something in C30 is the financing for the real estate values, and this is something that will hurt the Quebec economy, and it's something we can't support. So now my question, this will be for Mr. Poloz. When we look at the extent of the crisis and the responses of government and central banks that have been done across the world, it's really scary. This is without precedence, and it would seem that it's working well. But given that these are very high amounts, I think that there is a risk of inflation. Mr. Poloz was saying maybe, as he said in another life, there could be deflation. So I think that there may be bubbles in certain markets, in the real estate market, for example. So when we look at all of the risks, we need to look at what could happen, since we've lost our regular landmarks. So, Mr. Poloz, according to you, what are the risks that we should be looking at, or which sectors could there be risks where we could see a prolonging of the recession? We could talk about the exchange rate. We could talk about bubbles in certain sectors. So you spoke about a recovery. And do you think that will some sectors have a harder time with their recovery? And will that mean that we may have a new crisis? And with climate change, should we be looking there towards the risks, or where should we be looking? Should we be looking at preventing a new crisis, a new pandemic, or what should we be doing? Thank you.
Okay. Well, of course, there are many risks. We are, as you indicated, we've never been here before. And so the signposts that we're reading are not as reliable as usual. I can say flippantly that don't worry about inflation. Inflation depends on demand and supply. Always has. But we don't know for sure how much demand has been suppressed by COVID-19, how much of the policies we're putting in place will translate into more demand, and what is the supply side doing? When I talk about scarring, what I'm talking about is permanent losses of companies, permanent losses of jobs, permanent losses of industrial or commercial capacity. And that means that your supply is coming down when demand is rising. That of course, would have inflation potential. So the way I portrayed our response, it is that we should be playing those odds, which is what risks do we want to manage? Well, let's have policies that increase investment, either directly, such as in infrastructure, such as in social infrastructure like childcare, but such as in incentives to vastly increase investments in carbon capture, for example, which is investment, but on the green line. Those things are things that add to capacity and are anti-inflationary in their effect. And so they mitigate that risk that there might be an outbreak of inflation. Central banks, of course, are watching this much more carefully than I do, and their job is clear. And so I have complete faith in how that will turn out. A fourth wave, a fifth wave are major risks that we face. Sectors that are struggling, as I said, can translate into exits. But I would just say on this, there have been many company entries, many firms created during this episode. I was quite amazed that we lost more than 100,000 businesses during last summer. But by the time we got to the end of the year, we had gotten back over 80% of the businesses, and they're not the same businesses. They are brand new businesses that are entering the market in the middle of a pandemic. This shows how resilient the Canadian economy is. The last risk I'll mention is I think there's a risk that there will be some form of a crisis in somewhere else in the world, an emerging market crisis. And some countries do not have the institutional capacity or the fiscal capacity that we have, but they're dealing with the same problems that we are.
Okay, we are going to
country like
move
Brazil,
on.
for instance.